In October 2025, Ukraine and Sweden signed a letter of intent regarding potential provision of 100 to 150 Gripen fighters, one of the largest potential fighter orders in the platform's history. While the letter of intent represents serious framework discussions rather than finalized contracts, what makes this development particularly significant is the potential role Canadian manufacturing could play in accelerating delivery timelines that Swedish production capacity alone couldn't achieve. Let's examine what's been confirmed, what remains under discussion, and why the possibility of Canadian involvement in production represents potentially transformative development for Ukrainian air defense capabilities. The confirmed foundation. The letter of intent signed in October 2025 establishes serious framework for Ukraine potentially acquiring 100 to 150 Gripen E and F fighters. A letter of intent isn't a binding contract. It's a formal expression of serious interest, establishing parameters for future negotiations. It signals both parties intend to work toward actual agreements, though substantial work remains before contracts get signed. Ukraine's interest in Gripen makes operational sense. They're engaged in sustained conflict requiring robust air defense and ground attack capabilities. Their F-16 fleet has performed effectively. Documented intercept successes demonstrate the platform works, but the fleet remains limited relative to operational demands covering Ukraine's territory. Additional modern fighters would significantly enhance air combat capabilities. Gripen E offers operational characteristics potentially valuable for Ukraine's specific environment. Capability for operations from dispersed locations including highway strips, relatively rapid turnaround times with smaller crew requirements, advanced electronic warfare systems, and design accommodating both NATO standard and other weapons integration. These aren't marketing claims. They're design features developed for Swedish Air Force requirements that happen to align well with Ukrainian operational needs. The production capacity challenge. Here's where Canadian involvement becomes strategically relevant. Sweden's existing Gripen production capacity at Saab's Linköping facility is estimated at approximately 20 to 30 aircraft annually. At that rate, delivering 100 to 150 aircraft requires 5 to 7 years, potentially too slow for Ukraine's urgent requirements given ongoing conflict. This is where Saab's reported Canadian production proposal enters the equation. According to industry reporting, Saab has offered to establish Gripen assembly capability in Canada if Ottawa selects the aircraft for its own fighter replacement program. If that facility materializes, which remains contingent on Canadian procurement decisions not yet finalized, it could theoretically produce an additional 20 to 30 Gripens annually. Combined production from both Swedish and potential Canadian facilities could deliver 40 to 60 aircraft yearly. At that rate, 100 to 150 total aircraft could be delivered in 3 to 4 years rather than 6 to 7. For Ukraine's operational timeline, that difference could be strategically significant. Jets arriving while conflict continues versus potentially arriving after outcomes are determined. The reported production split scenario. Industry analysis suggests a potential production split where Sweden handles approximately 50 aircraft from existing Linköping capacity, while potential Canadian facilities could produce roughly 100 aircraft. This would leverage both countries' capabilities, Sweden maintaining design authority and quality certification, while Canada provides expanded manufacturing capacity. All aircraft, regardless of final assembly location, would reportedly use Rolls-Royce EJ230 engines. If Montreal production of those engines materializes as discussed in Saab's Canadian proposal, it would create integrated supply chain where engines, and potentially airframes, both come from Canadian facilities for certain aircraft. This represents a hypothetical production scenario contingent on several factors: Canadian selection of Gripen for its own procurement, establishment of Montreal assembly facilities, finalization of Ukraine's letter of intent into actual contracts, and arrangement of financing for Ukrainian acquisition. None of these are guaranteed. All remain under active discussion and evaluation. Strategic significance for Ukraine. If this production scenario materializes, the strategic implications for Ukraine would be substantial. Aircraft procured through Swedish and potential Canadian channels wouldn't be subject to U.S. export controls or ITAR restrictions that apply to American systems. This creates supply chain resilience, less vulnerable to political volatility or changing American administrations. Ukraine has experienced uncertainty regarding sustained Western military support as American political leadership and congressional priorities shift. Diversifying fighter sources to include European-designed, potentially Canadian-built aircraft with British engines creates supply chains operating independently of U.S. regulatory frameworks. That's not anti-American positioning. It's prudent risk management for a country whose survival depends on sustained weapons access. The operational sovereignty matters tactically as well. Aircraft without American components don't require U.S. approval for modifications, operational deployments, or weapons integration. Ukrainian Air Force commanders make decisions based on Ukrainian operational requirements, rather than coordinating through external approval processes. Combat validation through F-16 operations. Ukraine's F-16 operations provide important context for why Gripen procurement makes operational sense. Ukrainian pilots have demonstrated effectiveness with Western fighters, despite skeptics claiming crews trained on Soviet-era aircraft couldn't transition successfully. Documented intercept successes, ground strike missions, and operational integration with existing air defense systems prove the transition works. Gripen represents logical capability expansion, building on that proven transition success. The platform offers NATO compatibility, similar to F-16, while potentially providing operational advantages in dispersed operations, electronic warfare capability, and maintenance efficiency, all characteristics Ukrainian operational experience has identified as particularly valuable. Integration with existing F-16 fleet would be complementary rather than replacement. Both platforms use NATO standard weapons, operate through similar command structures, and integrate with ground-based air defense. Ukrainian Air Force wouldn't face binary choice. They would operate both platforms in roles where each provides advantages, creating operational flexibility single-platform fleets can't match. The Canadian production validation angle. For Canada, if Ukrainian orders materialize and involve Montreal production, it would provide powerful validation of Canadian defense industrial capacity. This wouldn't be speculative export market. It would be a nation engaged in existential conflict, ordering fighters from Canadian facilities because that production serves urgent operational needs. No higher validation exists for defense industrial capability than military forces ordering equipment to use in ongoing combat. It demonstrates that Canadian production isn't experimental industrial policy. It's operational defense manufacturing serving real wartime requirements under actual pressure. That validation potentially influences other countries' procurement calculations. If Ukraine, whose air force is literally fighting for survival, trusts Canadian-assembled Gripen for combat operations, other nations evaluating procurement can be confident in Canadian manufacturing quality and reliability. Financing complexity. Financing 100 to 150 fighters represents a substantial challenge for Ukraine given economic pressures from sustained conflict. However, financing mechanisms potentially involve multiple contributing sources: donor countries providing grants or credits, Canadian export financing, European support programs, and Ukrainian defense budget allocations. Multiple NATO and allied countries have strategic interest in Ukraine fielding capable air force that can effectively contest Russian air operations. Those countries potentially contribute to financing even when procuring non-American platforms, because the strategic objective, Ukrainian air defense capability, matters more than specific platform origin. Critically, if financing arrangements operate primarily through European and Canadian mechanisms rather than U.S. programs, they function independently of American congressional appropriations or executive branch policy shifts. That creates financial resilience, paralleling the supply chain resilience from non-American components. Technology transfer and sustainment. Beyond aircraft acquisition, reported arrangements would involve substantial technology transfer for maintenance capability, crew training, supply chain establishment, and operational doctrine development. This knowledge would remain in Ukraine, enabling independent Air Force operations for decades beyond immediate conflict needs. Ukraine wouldn't just receive aircraft. They would develop sovereign capability to maintain, operate, and potentially modify platforms independently. Maybe Ukrainian operational experience eventually contributes to Gripen capability enhancements or modification programs. The expertise builds and compounds rather than creating permanent dependency on external support. Strategic implications. Beyond Ukraine, Ukraine potentially ordering Gripen from Swedish and Canadian production creates precedent with broader NATO implications. If a nation actively engaged in conflict can arrange major fighter procurement outside American systems and regulatory frameworks, peacetime procurement becomes substantially easier for other allies. The precedent establishes that European-designed, Potentially Canadian-built fighters with British engines represent viable alternative to American platforms for significant operational requirements. Countries hesitant about appearing to reject American systems can reference Ukrainian operational validation when justifying similar procurement choices. The timeline reality check. It's crucial to emphasize current status. Ukraine and Sweden have signed a letter of intent, not finalized contracts. Canadian Gripen production facilities haven't been constructed. They're contingent on Canadian procurement decisions under active evaluation. Financing arrangements for Ukrainian acquisition remain under development. Delivery timelines are projections based on hypothetical production scenarios. Substantial work remains before letters of intent convert to binding contracts, before Canadian facilities become operational, before financing is secured, and before first aircraft deliveries occur. Defense procurement of this complexity typically requires years from initial framework agreements to operational capability. But the trajectory is clear. Yet the direction of developments is increasingly evident. Ukraine has serious interest in substantial Gripen procurement. Swedish government and Saab are actively working toward arrangements making that possible. Canadian production capacity is being explored as mechanism for accelerating delivery, and financing discussions are advancing among multiple potential contributing countries. Whether all these elements successfully align into finalized agreements remains uncertain, but the momentum is building. The operational logic is sound. The strategic rationale is compelling, and the precedent it would establish. Major European fighter procurement outside American systems serving actual combat needs would be historically significant regardless of whether contracts ultimately reach 100, 150, or different numbers. Ukraine's letter of intent for 100 to 150 Gripen fighters represents serious framework for potentially transformative Air Force modernization. If Canadian production facilities materialize as discussed in Saab's proposals, they could accelerate delivery timelines, making aircraft operationally relevant during ongoing conflict, rather than arriving after outcomes are determined. This wouldn't be anti-American positioning. It would be prudent diversification, creating supply chain resilience less vulnerable to political volatility. It would validate Canadian defense industrial capacity under the most demanding test possible, serving combat requirements for forces actively engaged in conflict. The confirmed letter of intent establishes foundation. Canadian production proposals create mechanism for accelerated delivery. Ukrainian operational requirements drive urgency. Financing discussions advance among multiple supporting countries. Whether all elements successfully align into operational reality remains to be determined. But the serious exploration of that possibility already represents important shift in alliance procurement dynamics and Canadian defense industrial positioning. The details will emerge as negotiations progress, facilities potentially get built, and contracts potentially get signed. What's already clear is that the conversation has fundamentally changed regarding where NATO and allied countries acquire fighters, whose approval is required, and what sovereignty means in an era when even close defense partnerships face uncertainty. Ukraine's letter of intent, and the potential Canadian production role in serving it, marks that change, regardless of precisely how many aircraft ultimately get delivered from which facilities.